Hey everybody, on to mini lecture number 2 in week 2 of Geography 4880. We left off here last time where we were beginning to understand the rise of regional geography in the 1930s or so. Remember that this is a reaction to environmental determinism that says, the environment is the determining influence on culture and society. Instead, it is trying to emphasize regional geographies and in turn trying to emphasize particular places on the surface of the earth as not just physically different in terms of topography and climate and so on, but culturally different, culturally homogeneous entities that can be said to be different from one another, okay? Which is how we get things like this, which is positing shared physical and cultural similarities amongst different parts of, in this case, the US, okay? So if we look to the yellow shaded area there, we have the so-called Great Plains, which is going to be not just a cultural region in terms of shared livelihood and maybe attitude and maybe politics, but also to some extent some shared ecology in terms of short grass prairie and also shared climate in terms of limited rainfall, okay? So this kind of differentiation of space into particular regions was in many ways what geography was in the 1930s. And we're going to talk more about that in this mini lecture. In case this means nothing to you because you're not so familiar with the US, this is not something that has only ever been done in the US. Okay, here's one example from Canada. And we could debate endlessly about whether or not you think this actually makes sense. The colors are kind of hard here to see, but this is someone's attempt to differentiate different parts of provinces into the northern far west, which somehow includes all of Alberta, parts of Manitoba and Cascadia, and something called the Leaf, which encompasses most of southern and northern Ontario for that matter. Whether you think this is right, it is someone's attempt to say, well, these are the culturally and biophysically homogeneous areas, relatively homogeneous areas within Canada, okay? And in the 1930s, under regional geography, it was seen as geographers' job in order to do this kind of distinguishing of the world and to take one of these, focus on it, and describe everything possible about it. To take northern far west Canada and describe its economy, culture, physical geography, languages, so on and so forth, politics, history, okay? Geography was seen as the synthesizing science, okay? Take a second here, pause, think about other kinds of regions you can think of. Maybe it's for Canada, maybe it's for the US, maybe it's for any other part of the world you can think of. When you think of the regions of the world or regions of a specific part of the world like Southern Ontario, where are you thinking about? How do you divide that space up? On what basis? Are you making distinctions solely on ecological characteristics about areas that are, share the same sort of vegetation? Are you thinking about areas that share the same kind of climate? Are you thinking of areas that share the same language, the same government? When you think about the regions of the world, how are you thinking about that? How does it help you think about the world? So now you've taken a second to think through that and think about the own kind of regions that you come up with. Let's take a more in-depth look at regional geography as it existed and came to prominence in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. So writing in 1929, James said, the regional concept constitutes the core of geography. The face of the earth, whether it's the US or Canada, as we just saw, can be marked off into areas of distinctive character. And this really, James continued to say, has been the continuous theme of geographic study through the ages, the focus of attention on particular places in order to more completely understand them. Now, regional geographers saw regions as more than the sum of their constitutive parts and processes. So In other words, geographers saw regions as more, greater than greater than the sum of their parts, right? So, there was something important about characterizing regions because it led to understanding them and understanding what happened in them as more than just, well, GDP here is $2 billion and the language is English and whatever. It was about regions as fundamental, essential entities that really could help explain, or at least better describe, the world as it existed. Okay. And indeed, regional geographers during this time weren't so interested in explanation. They weren't so interested in trying to explain big philosophical questions like what is the relationship between humans and the natural world. They were certainly, some of them were more interested in that others, and they certainly were interested in relationships between humans and environment, but they weren't going to get themselves into making big generalizations about how the world works as a whole and its fundamental laws and all that. They were more interested in just taking time to describe particular and specific places rather than theorizing and generalizing. Okay, so taking the time and indeed making careers out of describing the geography of Southern Ontario or the geography of the US Midwest or whatever it may be, becoming experts in those specific regions. Indeed, for regional geographers, it seemed better to make small-scale claims about small-scale places rather than to fall into the trap of spurious generalizations. And this is a subtweet. This is a slight at environmental determinism, which made very broad, sweeping generalizations about, the relationship between climates and people and civilizations and the rise and fall of different civilizations. So how do we do regional geography? How is it done? Well, as your textbook notes, we really saw 4 different strands of thinking on regional geography at this time. Generally, though, the idea was take a defined and perhaps relatively small area. Southern Ontario, maybe even one specific section of Southern Ontario, maybe the Greater Toronto area in the Horseshoe, rather than start with an object or process. So start with that space or region, rather than starting with, say, levels of immigration. Okay, and then describing how it varied across all the world. Instead of doing that, just take a small area and describe everything that's going on in it, including levels of immigration, GDP, language, everything. So these 4 strands then, largely did that, but they had some differences amongst them. So, there was French regional geography led by Vidal de Leblanc, who came up with the idea of genre de vie, which is different ways of living life that gave their expression on the landscape, the paysage. Okay, so different ways of making different cultures of relating to the land could be read through the land, in particular landscapes, paysages. Okay, and so for the French regional geographers, that they were really interested in the unity of people and land as sort of inseparable connection there. And indeed, they emphasized what's known as possibilism. So in contrast to environmental determinism, which says climates make people, French regional geographers said, well, there are many different possibilities for the ways in which humans can relate to their environment, or indeed the ways in which environments can shape human societies. So very much in line with Carl Sauer, and although he was not a French geographer, very similar sorts of thinking there. Richard Hartshorne, an American geographer based at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, took a different approach, one less empirically oriented, that is to say, less focused on fieldwork and observation of actual specific, pieces of evidence about particular areas, and more philosophical in nature. And his, idea here was regional geography is about areal differentiation. Okay, thinking through how areas are different from one another. That is to say, how regions exist as concrete entities across space. Geography for him was the totality of things found in a region or place. Indeed, geography was that synthesizing science, everything that happened in a place, okay? Each place being particular and unique from another. Just as history might be said to be a synthesizing science based on time, okay? Everything that happens, over time. Rather than a specific, a more general focus on, processes or something. The third strand of regional geography at this time was actually, as your textbook notes, led by Soviet geographers in the Soviet Union and Russia. And this took a real approach focused on economic planning. So as the Soviets sought to restructure the Russian economy, they said, well, we need to take into account the fact that capitalism has not equitably extracted resources from the landscape. Indeed, they saw nature and they saw that the economic map did not tally up with the map of natural resources. So places like Moscow and St. Petersburg or Leningrad was, those were where factories and industry was concentrated. That is not where the natural resources were concentrated. So the Soviets, in order to sort of deal with that bifurcation between the urban centers and the rural parts of the country, decided, well, we're going to try to plan economic development based on where those natural resources and based on regions where we see a combination of natural resources as well as cultural accumulations from the past and particular skilled populations. We're going to identify where those things are happening and invest our resources in them, move industries out towards those areas. Okay. And finally, that fourth strand of regional geography at this time was bioregionalism, which really emphasized the environmental dimensions of regions by positing an essential core physical definition of a region, most notably in terms of hydrodynamics, so watersheds, different watersheds nested at different levels as defining regions. So the bioregionalists, would start with those actually existing divisions of the world based on ecology or indeed based on hydrology. But then, also say, well, we can also map human populations and cultures and governance onto those entities, and indeed even spirituality, perhaps. Okay, so the bioregionalists, as well as the Soviets here, took more action-oriented approaches toward regional geography at this time. They actually wanted to change how we govern and live our lives based on the definition of different geography, based on identifying, defining, and implementing different regions. So we'll end here, our second mini lecture, and we'll pick it up. We'll just talk about sort of the legacy of regional geography and then move right into reactions to it in our next mini lecture.